The U.S. Senate Republican primary continued to heat up this week. In a Colorado Springs debate, Darryl Glenn called into question how Jon Keyser earned his Bronze Star. Meanwhile, Maureen Moss, the woman who allegedly forged signatures while collecting for a company working for the Jon Keyser campaign, was arrested on 34 felony charges. This is all a great segue because at 9 o'clock tonight, right here on Channel 12, we'll be featuring our hour-long debate with the 5 Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate primary, so be sure to stay tuned and check that out. But David, the floor is yours. When we look at this primary, have we seen a front runner emerge?
No, not yet. But it's great that the alleged signature forger, Maureen Moss, was arrested, because that sends a really important signal in future petition campaigns. You can understand why petition gatherers who are doing short-term work for not that much money could easily be tempted to do shortcuts and just fill in names out of the phone book or something like that. So it's really important that the law enforcement system send the signal that you can't ever do that. In terms of Glenn's attack on Keyser for the Bronze Star, well, we can go back to, if you say something like that, you better be able to prove it. Now, people attacked John Kerry accurately when he was like, I won 3 Purple Hearts, was the theme of his campaign, and his combat fellow soldiers persuasively showed that probably 2 out of the 3 were pretty sketchy. The middle one was legitimate, but not the others. But for Glenn to go after Keyser on the Bronze Star like this I'd say it's a high-risk strategy. Mitch McConnell slammed Glenn for having received the Senate Conservative Fund, or whatever it's called, endorsement. I don't think it was very persuasive. His point was, well, they endorsed Todd Akin. Well, everybody's endorsed somebody stupid who self-destructed at some point in a campaign. Just look at what the Democratic and Republican parties are about to do. So the fact that they made a mistake with Akin doesn't mean that it was wrong for them to endorse Glenn.
Eric, I guess I remember the esteemed former host of the show, Peter Boyle, as I recall, does Maureen Moss doing the perp walk help Jon Keyser?
No, it doesn't help Jon Keyser. I mean, because as long as this issue stays in the news, no one reasonably believes Jon Keyser was telling Maureen, okay, let's circle your M this way or whatever in her distinctive handwriting. Keyser doesn't have no one thinks Keyser has culpability here, but every time this is in the news, it brings up all those visions of that awful Channel 7 interview where he basically froze, where he was a deer in the headlights. So it is not good news for Keyser, even though it is the appropriate prosecution to take place. This thing is totally up for grabs, and I've seen sleepy primaries before. This is one of the sleepier ones I've seen. Yes, it's heated up and charges are being thrown back and forth, but I think we were talking earlier about oxygen, and I think the presidential race, and particularly Trump, has taken up so much oxygen. There's just not a lot left for this Senate race. I can make a plausible case for any of these 5 candidates to emerge victorious. The analogy to me is a number of years ago, better part of 2 decades ago, when our former table mate, Tom Tancredo, won a ticket to Congress. It was a 5-way Republican primary. Tom won that primary with 27% of the vote. Here you have 5 candidates, all of whom, none of them are going to get a tiny sliver of the pie. They'll all get a real piece of the pie. I think somebody will win this between 25 and 30% will be the winning number. I think it could almost be any of the 5. I think maybe 2 or 3 have a better chance than the other 2 or 3. And then the last question is it a nomination worth having, given Bennett's strength, not unassailable strength, but relative strength to where Udall was, weakness of the Republican field, et cetera, and giving Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. So, if this started out as being a big Republican prospect of a pickup seat around the country, and I think those visions have really waned in terms of the likelihood of that happening.
Penn, with the primary season the way it's gone, without a clear front runner, without a lot of press that isn't about signatures, can the eventual winner on June 20th build enough momentum to take out an incumbent? I know it's only a 1-term incumbent, but that, in Colorado history, that does not happen very often. What do you think?
No.
The reality is this. You have 5 people running for the Republican nomination who most people never heard of before, really, throughout the state. You've got one of them who I think is taking an interesting approach. Jack Graham in his TV commercials is almost running the general election now thinking nobody knows who I am anyway, so I may as well go on TV and talk about a bunch of stuff that isn't really of any consequence, but try to be a nice guy and have a bunch of different color faces sitting around the kitchen table with me. And maybe I'll get 27% like Eric said, because I think that's probably about where you need to end up to win the primary. And then I'll at least take my chances against Bennett. He probably sees himself as more moderate than the other 4 in the contest with him, so thinks that maybe he can undermine Bennett. But the reality is, the way the presidential primary is shaping up, it's taken all of the air out of the room. Nobody knows who these 5 guys are to begin with. Nobody's paying much attention to them. And when one of them eventually becomes the nominee, the problem they're going to be faced with is the head of their ticket is a guy who didn't even win the Republican primary preference, whatever the party wants to call it, here in Colorado, because all of the Colorado delegates went to Ted Cruz. So, you're running for a seat where the head of the ticket is not even the one that other people in your party wanted, and you're running against a relatively popular incumbent. No.
Patty, we've had a lot of fun talking about political ads around the table. Someone throwing at you. What do you think about Bennett's new political ad that basically talks about a broken Washington, although he's been a part of that broken Washington for about 6 years? Is that a good strategy?
It's not a bad strategy, because obviously that is going to be the only thing maybe one of the Republican candidate will go after, is that he's an incumbent in Washington. But if you look at Bennett's record, he has worked on compromises. He's shown he's willing to take a step to work with the other side, and he can back that up. I was thinking today when I saw Mike Kopp's name, because he's now head of Colorado Concern, how impressive the candidates were for the Republican candidates for governor 2 years ago, running against Hickenlooper, running against an incumbent, but a much more interesting campaign. You're right, there's not room for a lot of discussion now, but when you see, even Scott Gessler, I'm feeling nostalgia for him now, that he would be a really interesting person to run against Bennett. It's just 5 really lackluster candidates.